Hi, today I'm going to be talking about language and labels, and this is found in chapter 3 of the book under learner differences and learning needs. So, in essence, the language and labels part of this chapter says that labeling students is controversial. It is something I think we as teachers sort of deal with and experience every day, the repercussions of children receiving labels with their families, and then us as educators trying to give them labels sometimes. To help them get the services that they need, but also to explain some of the behaviors that we see in schools. One of the big shifts in education over the years, and I remember this even from when I was in school, is that now we're using people first language. And so, what people first language is that um, people, we place the person above the disability. So, you are a person with something, not blank person. So, for example, you're a person with autism, you are a person with an emotional disability, not an emotionally disturbed student, not an autistic student. Um, I first learned about this language difference when I was in college and I was working in San Francisco with a homeless project. And I heard a speaker give a very powerful speech about once someone is labeled, they take on that label and that identity. And for people dealing with homelessness, for them, that label is that of a homeless person, of a bum, of things that you might call someone on the street a beggar, and they lose their identity. In fact, on average, homeless people can people dealing with homelessness can go about 4 months without hearing their actual name. Um, and so instead of becoming a person within a battle, a person battling something, they become the battle, they become the problem, essentially. And so the book talks about it as far as our students are concerned, with them being self fulfilling prophecies. So, a student that was once labeled as learning disabled, that prophecy became self fulfilled. So teachers would teach the student at a lesser or lower level. The student would be tracked into lower level classes, and then it became harder for them to either mainstream or go into advanced placement classes, though they could potentially be capable of that. The best anecdote I've heard of this in my class is that there is a study done in which a teacher received two groups of students. Um, there was one class, they were split into two groups. One group received the label of being academically gifted. They were the gifted and talented children. And then the other classroom was just treated as a gen ed normal classroom. And I use that term normal loosely. Every classroom is different. Every classroom is normal. Um, but the students that were labeled as gifted and talented outperformed the students that were just treated as a general education classroom. There was no actual difference in cognitive IQ ability of the students, but the label made the difference. The teacher taught the student to that expectation. She taught them to the level that you would teach a student in a gifted and talented program, and it made a big difference in their end outcomes. And so on one camp, when it comes to labeling students with learning differences, they feel like teachers will teach those students less. And I've experienced this in arts with parents, and I hear their concerns a lot that their child won't receive the education that they deserve. Um, and then they recall their own educational experiences and when those kids were separated from the general population and ostracized. And you don't really know what happened to those kids because they were separated from the general population. They received a label, were treated as such and incapable. So they were treated with not respect to the label, but with what people thought the label should be. Um, and then more so in the chapter, they talk about the application of labels, which this is a part that I won't say it challenged my previous beliefs, but I've been reading more about it with regard and respect to having a teacher of color in the classroom and why that's important for students of color. In the application of labels section, they talked about the overrepresentation of students, of Black students particularly, uh, in being diagnosed with emotional disabilities and with intellectual disabilities. Um, they are also taken out of an educational environment because of behavior at a higher rate than any other student, where conversely, Asian students and Latino students are underrepresented. And so they attribute a couple of things to this. They kind of give a laundry list of things, a few of which being poverty, um, just educational background as far as like a familial legacy goes. But they also talk about teacher bias. And so, kind of a culmination of the summary of this part of the book, I would say the book wants educators to take a critical look at how we label and why we label students. Um, Having a label for a student doesn't tell you automatically what to do, but it does give you a place to start. Um, I would say in this reading, nothing really surprised me, but I do find it troubling that Black and Brown students are being expelled from school and overrepresented in certain categories and labels because of adult problems. I implore teachers to take a look at their own personal bias, of their own cultural competence. That was part of the reason I made the switch from bilingual to gen ed. So last year I was a bilingual teacher. I taught a class of Hispanic students completely, but still ended up with probably half of a class of Black students every day on a rotating basis because of discipline. And so what happens is that their teachers don't understand their culture. They haven't made a chance to connect with their students and learn about their culture. And so I was a Black face in the building. And so I am thankful that they sent them to me. But that was learning time that they weren't getting because my class was in Spanish. And so they're kind of getting a double injustice by being sent away from the learning environment and also receiving this behavior label. And sometimes they were sent home from school. And so I decided to kind of take control after reading an article about how students of color need teachers of color. It only takes one teacher of color to make a significant difference in a child of color's life. And so that children of color are more likely to be labeled, pushed into gifted and talented programs if they have a teacher of color. They are all students actually receive better social and educational learning outcomes if they're taught by teachers of color than by white teachers, to disparage white teachers. But I think there is a cultural competence and finesse that comes with being a person of color that our students need. And so I find it troubling that it's a trend. I find it promising, and I'm very hopeful at seeing all the teachers of color that I personally know. This didn't come from the book, but it's anecdotal. So how can I use this information in my classroom? I have students, and I've had students. So we're on our 5th week of school this week. And so I've had students in the past that I thought maybe they should be tested. Maybe there's some better way for me or someone else on our campus to support them. And then I'd get an IEP. And it's like, oh, it makes sense. This is what I'm supposed to be doing. But then I look at their IEP and all of their goals are low level. All of their goals are things that they can already do and they haven't been updated. So I guess we can still work on those skills. We can get the things in their IEP done, but they can also learn grade level content. And I think I want to be careful to use this because I'm kind of sticking to like the self-fulfilling prophecy of this more so than the language, because we're good on language in our classroom. We know that we all learn differently. We all have things that we aren't able to do yet, and some of us have things that we might not ever be able to do, and that's okay. But so we're learning what works best for us. But in my classroom, utilizing the information that I have in this chapter, I have to be cognizant and reflective as a teacher to make sure that I'm giving all of my students their best shot at their grade material, and that I'm not letting a label or a piece of paper dictate totally what they learn. The strategies that I have that I can use to support them in class and to support them with graphic organizers and to support them with level text, those sorts of things don't go away, but they can learn the skills that their peers are learning. They can engage in proper discourse. And so I'm challenging myself to make sure that I call on those students when they raise their hand. And if the answer is completely off topic and wrong, then we'll unpack it and we'll address it and we'll get there. But it's not that they can't do it. It's that we're going to work towards it. And so I'm not going to let a label define my picture of a child in my class. I guess in summation, I picked this particular section of the book because it was most closely related to things that I've seen and experienced in the world. I worked with individuals dealing with homelessness when I was in college in San Francisco, and we heard a wonderful talk from a leader in the community about how valuable and how important it is to see the person first. So instead of homeless people, we try to always use people dealing with homelessness, people suffering from homelessness, people without homes, because they are people first. They have a life, they have a personality, they have a spirit, just like our students. They have wants, they have goals, they have desires, and chances are they're the same as yours. But when we ostracize and other them by calling them homeless people, autistic children, we put a barrier before the personhood. And that barrier is what we see, and that barrier makes it harder for us to communicate. It makes us less willing to communicate. And when we do that to our children, they also are cognizant of the barrier and they're less willing to communicate and less willing to try. And so in thinking about my students who do have some sort of educational label, I think about the learned helplessness, the belief that they are in some way so different, and that they've internalized this belief, and so they're less willing to try. And so I think about all of the unlearning that we have to do because of a word, all of the unlearning that we have to do because of a diagnosis. I look forward to doing it this year. I look forward to learning more about them and what works best. So, yeah, I think that is it. Thank you for your time and your attention. See you on Tuesday.